Good morning, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving to you all. I am so glad that you've taken the time to uh, taken some time this holiday as we're celebrating Thanksgiving to God for all of His many blessings. That you're still keeping up with daily devotions through Redeeming Life Fellowship. If I haven't met you before, my name's Dan. I'm a teaching pastor here at Redeeming Life, and we're just glad that we have this opportunity together to follow the Revive School reading plan that's been leading us through the minor prophets as we've gone through Hosea, Joel, Amos as we finished up yesterday, and now we're entering, maybe to the relief of some, the shortest book in the entire Old Testament, and that is the prophet Obadiah, which is it's so funny, at least to me, how there's actually a lot of juicy meat. Maybe even juicier than your Thanksgiving turkey today. Juicy meat that you can actually pull out of such a short book. But today I wanted to just make a few observations about the book itself and then really hone in on one point that I think is always it's enduringly relevant to how we think about our relationship with God and our relationship with others. And so let's make a quick observation about the book. As we said already, it's the shortest book in the entire Old Testament, and we don't actually really know a whole lot of Obadiah. We know that the name Obadiah is a common name in the Old Testament. It means servant of the Lord or servant of Yahweh, and so as common as it was, it's hard to look back at the rest of the Old Testament and try and point out which one of these might have been the prophet Obadiah. So we don't really know. And what's interesting about you find in Obadiah is that, well, let me just jump back for a moment. When we're looking at the biblical narrative as a whole, it's primarily centered around not only God, but his relationship with his people, namely his covenant people, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the people of Israel, the nation, and Moses, and God leading them to the promised land, and the mission of God to bring about redemption and wholeness and renewal through his people. And that's the center point of where the narrative, the focus, is normally directed. But even as you know how when you're writing a story and the narrative has these main characters, these principal characters where it's mainly about them and they're the ones who drive the story, that it's oftentimes when you have a narrative, it's populated with secondary characters that are surrounded around the main characters. As in this case, or as in the biblical case, you will talk about Egypt, or maybe talk about Syria, or the Philistines, or Ammon, or Damascus, etc., etc. And there's one key secondary character who's primarily in view in this prophecy by Obadiah, and that is it's a prophecy directed at the nation of Edom. The nation of Edom. Not Eden, like the Garden of Eden and back in Genesis 1. It's the nation of Edom. Edom. And it's a nation, a rather small nation, geographically to the south of Israel and Judah. And what's so interesting about Edom is that there is a long and complicated history between the people of God, Israel and Judah, and that of Edom, where sometimes it's peaceable, sometimes it's not, but it's a storied history. And I'll try and explain this quickly. Where if you go back to Genesis and you're hearing the stories of the patriarchs, that's like the forefathers of the nation of Israel, namely Abraham, who begets Isaac through Sarah, but then Isaac has twins, Jacob and Esau. And Jacob ends up becoming the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, who become the Israelites. But then, based upon the biblical narrative, what we know about Edom is that they are the descendants of Esau. You can look back at this in Genesis 25 if you like. So that you have this small nation that's set to the background in the south of Israel, who are these long, storied ancestors where there's a traceable history, and it's sort of an ugly one, especially when you look back upon the nature of the conflict between Jacob and Esau. And so it's a complicated history between the Israelites and Edomites, to say the least. And it's not that different, I don't think, when thinking about the relationships that you have with your neighbors, wherever it is that you're settled next to, and that sometimes you can just get along with everyone minding their own business, but then other times what they're doing causes a conflict with what you're doing, and so that brings hostility. And or in some cases where if a tragedy befalls your neighbor, you sort of glow in that kind of self-satisfaction, that pride, where not only do you feel like this neighbor who's been causing you trouble, because they're afflicted, that makes your life better and that you can take advantage of their affliction. You know how, as you're shopping at the supermarket, and there's the supermarket tabloids, and they're oftentimes about celebrity sufferings or some juicy gossip that's been uncovered to expose how awful it is that the life of, Tom Hanks or Princess Diana are enduring right now because, well, you know what I mean. And so, but one of the things I think is so attractive about those tabloids is that the more that you can get your hands on and persuade yourself to believe this juicy gossip about the miseries of these famous people, that it makes your life look a lot better in comparison. And that you don't necessarily need to be able to take pride in your own accomplishments, whatever that they may be, but that there's a joy or satisfaction in watching somebody else fall and letting that be the source of your pride that makes you better than somebody else. And Edom seemed to be in that type of a situation where whatever is the context that's around this prophecy against Edom, that tragedy has befallen the people of God, probably in Judah. It may even have been the sacking of Jerusalem by the hands of the Babylonians. And the Edomites, in response to these brothers, they basked in the glory of Israel's fall because it was something that they felt that they were sort of exempt from the judgment of God, in that they could take advantage of Judah's fall and their conquest, so that as they'd be led off into exile, then Judah could become the targets of Edom's exploitation. This is an example where, for the people of Israel at that time, they would experience something like that and think, it really does look as though evil has prevailed, and that the people who deserved God's judgment, even though Judah certainly deserved God's judgment, that the people who deserved God's judgment got away scot-free, and that they're not going to be punished. And I also, another point that's actually pretty relevant about Edom and about its geographical landscape is that much of Edom is very mountainous, cave-like, where it was very easy for the people who are dwelling in Edom to depend on their security of living in such a geographical location, because it would be so hard to conquer. If you've ever looked at the geographical landscape of a place like Afghanistan, which is so it's so mountainous. But because the mountainous range is so difficult to traverse and invade, it's easy for an organization like the Taliban to be able to continue to dwell and inhabit that region, and to be able to retreat to places that are so hard to navigate that that you can sort of continue on indefinitely because your your fortifications are secure, and because you feel like those you're depending on those secure fortifications, that you can always escape the judgment for your actions. And God has a word to the Edomites. And let's look at the verses 1 through 4. Well, very, very short passage today. And it says this: The vision of Obadiah. This is what the sovereign Lord says about Edom. We have heard a message from the Lord. An envoy was sent to the nations to say, Rise and let us go against her for battle. See, I will make you small among the nations. You will be utterly despised. Let this next verse sink in. Verse 3. The pride of your heart has deceived you. You who live in the clefts of the rocks and make your home on the heights, who say to yourself, Who can bring me down to the ground? Though you soar like the eagle and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. That lesson, that message to the Edomites, I think is something that all of us need to listen carefully to, that we would not let the pride of our hearts deceive us, that our hearts become proud for all of the things that we depend on that make us safe, that give us the false impression that somehow we are still not accountable to God, and that He still doesn't have a claim on our lives. When a heart is taken captive by that kind of pride, it's always going to bring death and destruction. That type of sin that is swollen with pride and self-satisfaction to think that we can live our lives without ever being accountable to God, that that's always going to bring our destruction, as indeed it did ultimately lead to the destruction of Edom. Their rocky fortresses would not withstand the judgment of the Lord, and indeed, hence the reason why eventually, pretty swiftly, I think, following Obadiah's prophecy, that the nation did eventually fall and got sort of absorbed by nation tribes and invaders who they probably didn't expect coming, and they probably didn't take those threats seriously. And so, I know this isn't really an encouraging Thanksgiving message. Even today, I think it's important that we recognize what was true for Obadiah, that God is indeed sovereign over the nations. He's not just interested in His covenant people, but that all peoples have a responsibility, will be accountable to the living God. And He's going to deal with them, not merely just to exercise judgment, but judgment as steps towards renewal, which Obadiah has in view. And look at this, and then we'll close. Verses 15 through 18. The day of the Lord is near for all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your head. Just as you drank on my holy hill, so all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and drink as if they had never been. But on Mount Zion there will be deliverance. It will be holy. The house of Jacob will possess its inheritance. The house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame. The house of Esau will be stubble, and they will set fire to it and consume it, and there will be no survivors from the house of Esau. The Lord has spoken. Today, I pray that you go with God. I pray that we give thanks to God for who He is today, and that we do not let pride corrupt and deceive our hearts, but that in thankfulness to God that we would turn our hearts towards Him and follow Him wholeheartedly today. So thank you so much for taking the time to enjoy these devotions together. If you haven't, do subscribe to the YouTube channel so that you get daily notifications to follow along with the reading plan. And I pray God would bless you. And I pray that God would work in and through us today, that we would become more like Jesus, to follow Him wholeheartedly, and to put Him first in all we say and do. So God bless you, and take care.